Number 1. Poltergeist. It started one Christmas. My parents and I lived in a small town that was around 90 years old. It was in a small town called Bluffton in northeast Indiana. The year would have been 1996. We lived there from the time I was 7 years old to the time I was 19. From the very day that we moved in, I felt that I was not alone. At night, I would lie in bed with the intense feeling that I was being watched. One year, around Christmas time, I was having a friend spend the night. The heat had just shut off briefly, and she and I were sitting in the living room watching television when the temperature dropped substantially. As I rose to turn up the heat, the Christmas tree began to shake violently. Ornaments were falling off the ground left and right, and she and I were terrified. We ran upstairs and lay down on my bed. My white cat curled up with us, and my door was open slightly. When I gazed out into the dark hallway, I was horrified to see a tall, white figure run down the hall. I turned to my friend, and she acknowledged that she had seen the exact same thing. She never spent the night, ever again. Years passed, and things were uneventful. I became severely ill with a chronic illness, and was frequently hospitalized. That's when things began again. After coming near death twice, I began to be able to sense things that no one else could. I once again felt that nagging sensation of being watched. I ignored it this time, and the illness went into remission. Once again, the activity, if you could call it that, stopped. When I was 18, I began to experience things like never before. Upon the death of my beloved grandfather, I had become preoccupied with death and frequently visited cemeteries. That's when I noticed an increase in activity. It started out with the voices. It was like a television had been turned on, and there was a flurry of voices coming from downstairs, or even more frightening, outside my room. My parents were always asleep when this would happen, and the room was right next to mine, with a vent, so I could hear my parents sleeping next door. I would get up and check all the rooms, but there was no TV on, nothing to account for the voices. I was getting more and more scared as the voices started happening every night. Then, that's when I started seeing shadow figures. They varied in size, but they were always human-shaped, except for once. One night I was walking out of my room with my cat in my arms when she began to growl ferociously. She never does this. She's normally an extremely docile cat, and I was shocked to see her acting so. That's when I looked down the hall and saw a shadow the size of a large dog run down the hall quickly. We don't own a dog. We had owned one before I became ill, but we were forced to give it away due to the fact that we could no longer provide it with the proper care that it deserved. My cat growled and growled until the shadow disappeared. For all the other times that I saw shadow figures, they never took the form of a dog again. From that point on, the shadow figures were strictly human-shaped, some tall, some child-sized, but they frightened me to death. I would lie on my bed at night, tortured by the fear that I was going insane because no one else was experiencing this. When I confessed my experiences to my parents, they took me to a psychiatrist who could find nothing wrong with me. I continued seeing shadow figures up until the last few months that we lived there. As the months went on, I began feeling a dark aura spreading around the place. It was a heaviness, an uncomfortable feeling that I could never quite shake. Sometimes I would get frustrated with whatever was there. I would leave the room and turn off the light. The light switch would make an audible click every time someone turned it on or off. Each time I would shut it off, the click would echo, and I would turn around and the light would be back on. Finally, I said in annoyance, "Quit playing games! Could you shut the light off, please?" And sure enough, right before my eyes, the light shut off. One time, I shut off the light in my bedroom before I left the house, and when my parents and I came home, my dad said to me, "What did I tell you about leaving your light on?" And I replied shocked, "But I shut it off when I left." He had nothing to say to that. Another time I was lying in bed when I heard the audible noise of something sitting down in my desk chair. Sure enough, when I sat up, there was a visible imprint in the center of the chair, where someone would be sitting. Things would get so bad sometimes that I would be forced to sleep in my parents' bedroom, like I was a child. In August 2008, we moved to a new house far away from the old house. I have not experienced anything abnormal here, and the aura is much lighter. Perhaps it was my dabbling in the paranormal. I had tried communicating with spirits, had frequented cemeteries, and tried to provoke ghosts that had caused all the grief in that house. But one night, I went back there to get some of my things, and as I was leaving, I saw a dark figure run across the yard. I drove away and never looked back.
Number 2. The Christmas Morning Ghosts. Read by Darkness Prevails. Mrs. Miller and her husband decided to go away over the Christmas holidays in 2012, staying at a quaint little hotel known to them in the northwest of Scotland. Upon arrival, they were mildly shocked to discover they were the only guests in the hotel for the first 6 nights of their week-long stay. The hotel, or at least the building, was quite old and slightly run down, yet the couple looked forward to the solace. By this stage, I felt absolutely awful. I can honestly say I don't think I've ever felt so ill before, explained Mrs. Miller. Tired from the long journey they had that day, Mrs. and Mr. Miller went to bed around 11 p.m. At exactly 4 in the morning, I distinctly remember looking at the clock. I awoke feeling violently sick, she says. Above our door, there was a glass panel, and I noticed the light in the hallway was on, but was more concerned about how sick I felt to think anything of it. She went into the bathroom to splash water on her face while trying not to wake her husband. The bathroom door was very close to the door of the hotel room, and while in the bathroom, she could clearly hear footsteps marching back and forth, up and down the hallway outside. They were very loud footsteps, not walking particularly fast or slow. They were just very loud. I was more annoyed than concerned, Mrs. Miller says. After all, we knew the manager lived on the floor above us in the hotel, so it must have been him. But at 4 in the morning, why was he wandering around the hotel and making such noise? Then the light outside the hallway began to turn on and off, and with each on and off, there was a very distinct cracking noise to accompany it. By now, the footsteps were not merely walking up and down the hall, they were stopping every so often directly outside the Miller's room. It sounded like someone was deliberately exaggerating their footsteps to create as much of an audible racket as possible. I was certain someone was outside the door, she says. I could feel it so strongly. I still assumed it was the manager. Maybe I had been making a lot of noise, I thought, and he was listening in to check that I was okay. I expected him to knock, but there was nothing, until the footsteps retreated back into the main corridor and began stomping again. This happened several more times with the footsteps stopping outside the door. By this time, Mr. Miller woke up as his wife was coming out of the bathroom. He too heard the noises. She crawled back into bed, still feeling sick as ever, when suddenly the footsteps stopped. The couple listened for a while, but everything was quiet. As soon as the footsteps stopped, I felt immediately better, Mrs. Miller says. It was as if I had never been sick. Had I thought about it, I may have felt unnerved, but the relief was immense. We easily fell back to sleep. The next day, the Millers spoke to the manager, explaining what they experienced the previous night. They jokingly inquired as to why he had been bounding about in the corridor. He laughed and explained that he had not been in the hallway. Certainly not at that time. Rather, he had been watching television in bed until the small hours in his room, on the floor above on the other side of the hotel. He assured them that there was no one else in the hotel that night. Later that day, the Millers spoke to the receptionist. Mr. Miller decided to push the subject and flippantly asked her, "So which one is the haunted room?" "It's not the rooms," the receptionist replied. "It's the hallway." She had a look on her face that revealed that perhaps she shouldn't have said it, in case they thought she was silly. The Millers didn't laugh. The receptionist went on to say that a professor of psychology had taken a photograph in the very hallway during a visit, and the face of an elderly woman could clearly be seen. Furthermore, guests had reported footsteps walking up and down the hallways at 4 a.m., glasses smashing to the floor in certain rooms at the same time, and problems with the lights too. "What my husband and I found the most interesting," Mrs. Miller says, "were the lights switching on and off. When we pressed the light switches in the hallway the next day, they made an almighty cracking noise. Once you pushed the switch, you could not turn the light off again, but would have to wait for the light to go off by itself, as it was on a timer, or walk the approximately 18-foot long hallway to the other end and turn off the lights by the other switch. The night before, the lights had been turning on and off in 1-second intervals. An interesting experience for us, and quite odd on many levels."